Hey guys, welcome back. Another quick video here. This one is on speciation, which is a process that is related to but wholly different than evolution. So speciation is specifically the creation of new species. So to start that off, we need to define what we're considering to be a species. And for the most part, we're going to go with what's called the biological concept of species, which is to say, if a group of organisms can mate and create viable offspring that can themselves make offspring, those organisms are the same species. If you have organisms that can mate but not make viable offspring, they are different species. Okay. Now that doesn't work on an individual level, right? Like some individuals are incapable of creating offspring, but that's individual. We're talking about an entire population. Cool. That definition doesn't work for all organisms. Asexual organisms, for instance, obviously that doesn't work. Right? But for the most part, it is the cleanest definition of species to work with. So that's what we're going with, working in that context for this conversation. Cool. All right. So in order to create new species, two things are required. We need reproductive isolation of two subsets of the same species. Okay? And we need those two subsets to accumulate mutations. Now mutations happen at random, and the rate of mutations is relatively slow in most established species. Right? So this takes time. And so it's important that they're not able to interact and exchange genes, because then they exchange the mutations. And the whole point is that we want to accumulate enough mutations that the two subset populations become genetically distinct, to the point where if you put together their gametes, the chromosome sets don't align properly, you don't make good babies. That's the goal. Okay. Or rather, that's the process that results in having new species. And so the mechanisms that drive this reproductive isolation are labeled here. Okay. And so we have geographic isolation, and that's when there's a large structure of earthy stuff that's stopping the two populations from intermingling. Right? For instance, a mountain range, a lake, the ocean. Okay. If the organisms are small enough, it could be a river. There's some physical barrier that is keeping these two subsets of this population apart from one another. Okay. The next is the habitat-driven isolation, and this is similar in idea to geographic, where the two groups are physically separated, okay, but it's not as large of a scale. Okay. And so this could be like one subset lives in the canopy of the trees, and one subset lives on the ground. Right? There's not a physical barrier that's separating them, but the fact that they're living in these two different spots means they'll never mate with one another. And then we have temporal, which is time-based. And so this could be like one of the subsets likes to mate at dusk, and one of the subsets likes to mate in the morning. What's that thing called? Sunrise. Why not dawn? That's the word I'm looking for. One likes to mate at dusk and one likes to mate at dawn. Okay. Even though they're hanging out together, they might go to lunch together, they might, make TikTok videos together. They're never going to mate together because they mate at different times. Okay. And so they won't exchange those genes. Temporal. Then we have behavioral. Right? And so this is things like the two subsets might have different mating calls. They engage in different behaviors that are related to mating that is going to prevent them from mating. Okay? So again, they're in the same space, they're together all the time, they're hanging out, but they're never going to mate because they have different behaviors that keep them separate when it comes to mating. And the last is mechanical. This is where some aspect of the physical structure of the two subsets is different in a way that prevents them from physically mating. Right? And so their reproductive organs could be different shapes. Right? could be the reproductive organisms themselves. Like you could have a triangle and you could have a hexagon, and they don't line up. You can't go in, can't make babies. Right? It could also be the general size of the organism sets. Right? Like if you imagine different types of dogs, you have a big Great Dane, you have a tiny little Chihuahua or a cup poodle. What are those things called? Teacup poodles. Right? The size difference is just going to prevent the mating from happening. So some physical structure, some physical aspect of the two organisms is preventing them from mating. Yeah? And so through one of those mechanisms of isolation, right, we have our two subsets divided. So we have population of species A, and they get separated. Okay? Now at first, they're still both species A. Right? So if I were to rejoin them at this point in time, they could mate, make babies. Cool, no problem. But you give it enough time and you give it enough generations, right? Over each generation, you're going to get a little bit new set of mutations. Right? And so giving it time to build up and build up and build up, eventually, right, the genetic information of this subset of the population is going to be different enough from this subset that if you were to rejoin those two populations, those chromosomes no longer align in a way that's going to make a viable offspring. Right? So at this point in time, B and C are now new species. This speciation has occurred. And depending on what the mutations are, they might look very, 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 very similar still. Right? They might still be very much the same in structures and physiology. Okay? Just their genetics have changed. It's also entirely possible that they look very different. They might have been facing different environmental pressures. Natural selection might have pushed them in very different directions for morphological changes. But the important part here is that their genetics no longer align in a way that makes a baby. And that's speciation. You're welcome. Bye.